We are conditioned to view history through the lens of the survivor. The narrative etched into the stone of our cathedrals and printed in the pages of our textbooks is one of inevitable victory. We are told the story of a small band of fishermen who stood against the might of Rome and won. We are told that the gates of hell could not prevail, that the blood of the martyrs was the seed of a flourishing garden. But if you blow the dust off the oldest manuscripts, a different story emerges. A story not of victory, but of a predicted, catastrophic failure. The architects of the faith did not foresee a golden age of unity. They looked into the future and saw a smoking ruin. They saw a great apostasy, a total collapse of the authentic message, happening not centuries later, but immediately. The warnings were frantic, they were explicit, and they were terrified. Ancient texts, some scrubbed from the official canon and others left to rot in the deserts of Egypt, speak of a certainty that chills the blood. They prophesied that the church would not conquer the world, but that the world would hollow out the church and wear it like a costume. This was the dark secret of the first century. The apostles were not building for the ages. They were boarding up the windows against a coming storm. They believed the mystery of lawlessness was already at work, dissolving the foundations before the roof was even raised. This script will exhume that banned prophecy. We will look at the blueprints of the collapse. We will see how the warning bells were silenced by the very people the prophecies warned against. This is the autopsy of the early church, revealing that the institution we know might be the very fallen entity the founders were terrified of. Chapter 1. The savage wolves. The terror began before the first generation was in the ground. We often imagine the apostolic age as a time of pure, unadulterated truth, a brief window of perfection before the complications of history set in. This is a fantasy. The earliest documents we possess do not speak of a kingdom that would slowly grow into a beautiful empire. They speak of a besieged fortress where the gates had been left unlocked by the guards themselves. Consider the farewell of Paul the Apostle to the elders of Ephesus. The scene is recorded in the Acts of the Apostles, but it reads less like a goodbye and more like a horror story. He gathers the leaders, the men he has trained, and he does not promise them success. He looks them in the eye and tells them that after his departure, savage wolves will come in among them and will not spare the flock. The terror of this prophecy lies in the source of the danger. He did not say the wolves would come from the Roman Praetorian Guard. He did not say they would come from the pagan priesthoods of Artemis. He said, even from your own number, men will arise and distort the truth. The prophecy was specific. It predicted an internal coup. The leaders would become the predators. The call was coming from inside the house. In the second letter to the Thessalonians, this dark timeline is laid out with chilling precision. The writer speaks of a great apostasy that must happen. The Greek word used is apostasia, which implies a military defection, a revolt, a complete abandonment of the post. The text argues that a restraining force was holding back the chaos, but once that force was removed, the deception would be total. The man of lawlessness would not just attack the temple, he would set himself up in the temple. This was the paranoid atmosphere of the first century. It was not the dawn of a new era, it was the holding of a breath before a plunge. The writers of the New Testament epistles were frantically trying to plug holes in a sinking ship. They wrote of antichrists who had already gone out into the world. Note the plural. Not one distant villain at the end of time, but many, active and present in the congregations. We see this fear in the letter of Jude, a tiny text that reads like a desperate scream in a burning building. He warns that ungodly people have secretly slipped in. These were not outsiders attacking the walls. These were men feasting at the love feasts, the communal meals of the early believers. Jude calls them shepherds who feed only themselves, clouds without rain, and autumn trees without fruit and uprooted. The imagery is of a hollowed out ecosystem. The prophecy warned of the Nicolaitans, a shadowy group mentioned in Revelation, who were already corrupting the teachings from within, advocating for compromise with the Roman world. We see figures like Simon Magus, the magician who tried to buy the power of the Holy Spirit, establishing the archetype of the internal wolf. The prophecy suggested that the authentic movement was destined to be short-lived, a flash of lightning that would be immediately swallowed by the thunder of institutional corruption. By the time the last apostle died, the prophecy predicted that the baton would not be passed to faithful successors, but snatched by opportunists. The collapse was not a physical destruction of buildings. It was a spiritual eviction. The structure would remain, the rituals would continue, but the essence would be gone, leaving behind a beautifully decorated tomb inhabited by the very things the founders had tried to exorcise. Chapter 2. The Rotting Tower. If the canonical letters were the alarm siren, the Shepherd of Hermas was the detailed structural engineering report of the disaster. This text was one of the most widely read books in the 2nd century, considered scripture by church fathers like Irenaeus and Origen before it was quietly pushed aside and excluded from the Bible. It contains a vision that perfectly encapsulates the prophecy of the collapse. The protagonist, Hermas, is a former slave who is shown a vision of a great tower being built upon the waters. This tower represents the church. Thousands of men are dragging stones from the deep and handing them to the builders. The vision seems majestic at first, but it quickly turns into a nightmare of quality control. Hermas watches as thousands of stones are brought up that are useless. Some are cracked, some are too round to fit in the corners. Some are black as soot. These stones represent the believers and, more importantly, the leaders. The builders examine them and cast them away. The rejected stones are thrown far from the tower, rolling into the wasteland to be burned. The terrifying part of the prophecy is the sheer volume of the rejection. The tower is not being built easily. It is a struggle against defect. The vision explains that the white round stones are men who have faith, but also have the riches of this world. When persecution comes, they deny their Lord because of their wealth and their business affairs. They are useless to the structure unless they are cut down, stripped of their wealth, and made square, a painful process most refuse. But the vision goes deeper into the spiritual rot. It describes stones that fit but have cracks running through them. These are those who hold grudges, who have not made peace, who maintain the appearance of holiness but are internally fractured by malice. The prophecy warns that a church built of resentful, power-hungry people will not stand. It will crumble under its own weight. Hermas sees women in black personifications of vices like deceit, sadness, and lust, carrying stones away from the tower. The prophecy depicts a church that is being actively dismantled by the sins of its own members, even as it is being built. The construction is frequently halted because the Lord of the tower finds so few suitable stones. The text captures the deep anxiety of the 2nd century. The movement was growing, yes, but it was growing like a cancer, not like a healthy body. The stones were compromising the integrity of the whole structure. The prophecy suggested that a time would come when the Lord of the tower would come to inspect it and find that the walls were composed of black stones, souls dead to the spirit, feigning life. There is a specific focus on the double-minded, those who doubt. In the harsh reality of Roman persecution, doubt was a structural flaw that could bring down the whole building. A double-minded man would betray his brothers to the lions to save his own skin. The tower could not support them. The Shepherd of Hermas was eventually excluded from the canon. One has to wonder if it was excluded because it was not inspired or because its prophecy hit too close to the mark. It painted a picture of a church that was not a spotless bride, but a crumbling construction site plagued by incompetent workers and defective materials. It predicted that the collapse would come from the simple fact that you cannot build a divine house with human rubble. The church would survive as an institution, but as a spiritual vessel, it was already leaking water. Chapter 3. The merchant's invasion. While Hermas worried about the spiritual state of the stones, another ancient manual, the Didache, worried about the bank account. The Didache, or the Teaching of the 12 Apostles, is perhaps the oldest surviving manual of church order, potentially dating back to the 1st century. It contains a prophecy of collapse driven by a specific mundane engine: greed. The text provides a stark, brutal litmus test for distinguishing a true prophet from a false one. It says, if he asks for money, he is a false prophet. It is a simple rule. In the early days, the leaders were wandering ascetics, homeless and poor, relying on the hospitality of the brethren, but never demanding it. But the Didache predicted a shift. It warned of the rise of the Christemporos, the Christmonger, or the one who sells Christ for profit. The prophecy here is sociological. It predicted that as the movement settled down, it would attract con artists. It would attract men who saw the fear of God as a market opportunity. The text warns the community to watch the behavior of the apostles closely. If a prophet orders a meal in the Spirit and then eats it, he is a false prophet. If he stays more than 2 days without working, he is a false prophet. This was a desperate attempt to build a firewall against the collapse. The writers knew that once money entered the equation, the Spirit would leave. They predicted a takeover by the merchant class, and history confirms their fears. The pagan writer Lucian of Samosata, writing in the 2nd century, mocked the Christians for their gullibility. In his work, The Passing Peregrinus, he tells the story of a charlatan who infiltrates a Christian community, becomes their leader, and grows rich off their widows and orphans because they were too naive to see through his act. The prophecy was coming true in the public eye. The Christmongers were taking over. By the 3rd century, the wandering prophets had disappeared, legislated out of existence by the rising power of the bishops. These were no longer homeless preachers. They were administrators. They sat on thrones. They managed vast estates. They rubbed shoulders with governors and tax collectors. The Didache's prophecy of the collapse was the transition from a charismatic organism to a financial institution. It warned that when the leadership became a career path rather than a sacrificial calling, the connection to the divine would be severed. The collapse was the moment the church became a business. We see the shift in architecture. The early believers met in homes, in secret, facing one another. As the collapse set in, they moved into basilicas Roman law courts. The architecture itself changed the theology. In a basilica, the judge sits on a raised platform, separated from the people. The bishop became the judge. The community became the silent audience. The priesthood of all believers was replaced by a paid clergy. The tragedy of this prophecy is its banality. The church didn't collapse because of a grand cosmic war with demons in the sky. It collapsed because of the mundane, grinding corruption of coin. The mystery of lawlessness turned out to be the balance sheet. The holy city was turned into a marketplace. And the prophecy warned that once the tables of the money changers were set up in the sanctuary permanently, the presence of the divine would walk out the door, leaving behind a hollow shell run by managers and accountants. Chapter 4. The silenced alarm. The most disturbing aspect of these prophecies is not that they were made, but that they were silenced. The institution that rose from the ashes of the 1st century did not want to hear that it was a corpse. It wanted to believe it was the triumphant successor. So, the texts that predicted the collapse were buried, marginalized, or reinterpreted. The Apocalypse of Peter, found in the Nag Hammadi library, offers the most biting confirmation of this silence. It contains a vision where Jesus stands separate from the church, laughing at the ignorance of those who think they serve him. He points to the bishops and deacons, the official hierarchy, and calls them waterless canals. The prophecy in this banned text is that the many will be led astray by the few who claim authority. It predicts that the dominant church, the one that kills and persecutes to maintain power, is actually an imitation. It is a counterfeit designed to trap souls in the material world. The collapse happened when the counterfeit replaced the original. The text explicitly states that these false leaders will cleave to the name of a dead man, thinking they will become pure, but instead they become defiled. This was the Gnostic contention, that the true church went underground. It became invisible. The collapse of the visible church was inevitable because it was built on the wrong foundation, the foundation of power, fear, and matter. The true prophecy was that the living ones would always be a minority, hiding in the shadows of the great cathedrals, passing the keys of knowledge in whispers while the institution shouted from the rooftops. In the Gospel of Thomas, another text lost for centuries, there's a saying where Jesus accuses the Pharisees and scribes the religious authorities of taking the keys of knowledge and hiding them. They did not enter, and they did not let those enter who wished to. The prophecy was that the new church leaders would do exactly the same thing. They would become the new Pharisees, guarding the door to keep people out of the truth. The great erasure began in earnest in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Heresy hunters like Irenaeus and Tertullian launched massive campaigns to destroy these dissenting voices. They created the first index of forbidden books. They argued that there was only one truth, and they held the copyright. But by destroying the evidence of the warnings, they inadvertently confirmed them. The very act of persecuting their brothers proved they had become the wolves Paul warned about. The burying of these texts was the final act of the coup. By silencing the prophets of the collapse, the new institution could claim an unbroken line of succession. They could pretend that the Tower of Hermas was perfect, that the bishops of the Didache were humble, and that the wolves of Paul never arrived. But the sand held the secret. When the jars were opened in the desert in 1945, the alarm began to ring again. We are now forced to look at the history of the early church through the lens of this banned prophecy. We see the cracks in the foundation. We see the merchant's ledger on the altar. We see the wolf in the pulpit. The prophecy predicted that the truth would be trampled by the lie, and that the lie would be called holy. It is a dark, uncomfortable thought. It suggests that for centuries, the world has been looking at a ruin and calling it a castle. The collapse of the early church wasn't a future event they were afraid of. It was the history they lived, the tragedy they witnessed, and the secret they tried to warn us about before their voices were silenced by the very machine they predicted.